So who's all going to see this podcast?
Hopefully the whole world. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. We're pulling another one out of the archives. This one's with my name twin, Dr. Richard E. Bennett. In case you wanted to know, I'm Rick C. Bennett. And we're going to talk about temple work. Dr. Bennett has done some amazing work. He's a professor at BYU in church history, but he's really done some amazing work, once again, on the evolution of temple ordinances. I was really surprised to hear him say that a lot of our endowments for the dead were a result of spiritualism, which is some of the like Ouija boards and things like that were really popular after the Civil War and even a little bit later. So that's really interesting. We'll also talk about the Kirtland Temple, and he's just got some amazing insights. So I think you will enjoy my name twin, Dr. Richard Bennett. So check out our conversation. Welcome to Gospel Tangents Podcast. My name is Rick Bennett. I'm here with my name twin, Richard E. Bennett. I'm Richard. Yeah, I'm Richard C. Bennett. My dad is also Richard C. Bennett. So there's at least 3 Richard Bennetts that I know. So this will be a little confusing. But I go by Rick. What would you like me to call you?
I go by Dick.
Dick? Okay.
Or Richard.
More
formally.
More formal. Okay.
Mine's Richard E. Bennett.
Richard E. Yeah. So I'm Richard C. So I usually go by Rick. And
where do your Bennetts come from?
So my Bennetts come out of Philadelphia.
But before the United States.
I don't know. I'm stuck in Philadelphia. I can't get out of there. It's 1765. We need to talk after and see if we can figure out how to get me out of Philadelphia. But
no relation there.
I found a bankruptcy notice that Abel Bennett filed bankruptcy, and that's all I know.
In Philadelphia?
In Philadelphia. So he was born in 1765, I think. So, and actually, I did find out that I found a pension record for the Revolutionary War, so I go back to the Revolution.
Mine come from Devonshire, England.
Okay.
I came over in about 1840.
Do you have anybody in Philadelphia?
No, they're all Canadian.
All Canadian. So yours all Canadian. So, all right.
As far as I know.
Well, anyway, so I'd like to introduce you. I checked out your Wikipedia page, so you'll have to correct me if any of this information is wrong. But I understand you got a PhD at Wayne State University. I think it was in history. Is that...
American Intellectual History, they called it.
Okay.
Also in public history, archival management.
Okay. And then where did you get your undergraduate?
I got my master's degree here.
At BYU.
In American history,
okay.
With Marvin Hill as my chair.
Okay.
Professor Marvin Hill, whose work on Joseph Smith is quite significant. That's where I really got interested in the prophet Joseph, with Marvin Hill. And then I got my bachelor's here in English literature.
Okay.
So I got my BA here at BYU and my MA here at BYU and my PhD in Detroit, Michigan, Wayne State University.
Okay. So how did the guy from Canada come spend all this time at BYU?
Well, I got like I said, my bachelor's here at the Y. My parents joined the church up in Canada in 1952 when I was 6, and I sort of grew up hoping to go to BYU someday. I was the only Latter-day Saint in our whole high school there in Sudbury. Mm-hmm. So I came to BYU so that I could be close to the church, and then served a mission to Texas from 1967 to 69. I remember leaving Canada, it was 30 below zero, and arriving in Dallas, Texas, it was 90 degrees above, and that was in February 1967.
Wow.
So I knew I was going the right place, or the wrong place, one or the other.
Now, you were president of Mormon History Association. Was that the one that was in San Antonio?
2014.
Yes.
Yep.
I remember that one well. So I'm sure that... Did you serve in San Antonio?
I served in San Antonio. My first place was San Antonio. So it was like coming home. Because MHA's conference in 2014 was just exactly where I served.
Oh, wow. That was a fun one. I'd never been to San Antonio.
47 years before.
Wow. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I've really enjoyed a lot of your talks about the temple, and that's kind of why I'm here today. I understand you're working on a new book about the evolution of temple. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, it's a culmination of a lot of research I've been doing on various chapters on the rise of Mormon temple consciousness in the 19th century. And the title of the book is tentatively The Wisest Course, taken from Wilford Woodruff's comments about the manifesto, which are found in the Doctrine and Covenants, where he says, which is the wisest course to follow. So it's going to be on that topic. I haven't finished it yet, but we're making some progress. A topic like this is very challenging. It's right on. But I've published several articles already. It's going to be a kind of a summation of several of those articles, plus some new research I'm doing, particularly in the Nauvoo period.
Okay. Well, good. I'd like to kind of take us from Kirtland and Nauvoo to Salt Lake as we talk today. So let's talk a little bit about Kirtland. Kirtland was the first temple. I know a lot of Latter-day Saints probably wonder, why is it that we don't actually own that temple anymore? Has anybody ever asked you that? Or
oh, yes.
What's your response?
It's a very good question. We wanted to sell it. Brigham Young made the order to sell it.
Oh, really?
Just like he did with the Nauvoo temple.
Oh.
We needed the money to move west. The church was in a very, very difficult financial situation in 1845. And as it became very clear that we're going to have to leave Nauvoo, and to fund the exodus of 20,000 people, or however thousands of people are going to be, it's going to take a lot of money. And we had some properties, including the temples. And so Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 made the conscious decision, not publicized to too many people,
Wow.
that we need to sell off the temples. And so we did, or at least we tried to do so. Not just the temples, but other properties in far west and wherever we could to fund the cost of building those wagons to go west. It's not well known in church history that most Latter-day Saints went on wagons that were owned by the church, that weren't their own wagons. They had to give up those wagons at Garden Grove, Mount Pisgah, winter quarters, to send them back to Nauvoo to bring out the rest of the saints. And so the cost of each of those wagons is very formidable. And so we needed, when I say we, the church needed, especially Newell K. Whitney was the presiding bishop, ordering all these wagons and supplies from St. Louis with funds that were available to us from anywhere. Donated funds, tithing funds, property sale funds. And that was the genesis for the sale of the Kirtland Temple.
Who did we sell it to?
Well, eventually it's a very complicated story. Perhaps the leading scholar on this would be Locke Mackay, who is now a member of the Quorum of the 12 of the Community of Christ, the reorganized church. He's written extensively on it. Others have. But eventually, let's just put it this way, it went through private hands from one place to another. Martin Harris became sort of like the janitor for it for many years. We never received much money for it. Eventually, however, the Kirtland Temple falls into the hands of the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Okay. The Nauvoo Temple, we tried desperately to sell it, when I say we, the LDS Church, to the Roman Catholic Church. We invited the Bishop of St. Louis to come up to Nauvoo, and several priests, and they were taken on tours of the Nauvoo Temple. We tried to get $100,000 for it. I think it finally sold for $2.
Oh, really?
Because the Catholic Church finally decided they weren't interested in it. It wouldn't fit their needs. Some think it was sold to the Icarians, who came in what, 48?
1848?
Somewhere around there, but it was destroyed by a tornado and then burned.
That's so funny because...
Burned, and then a tornado knocked down the remnant walls, and so there was never any consideration for the Nauvoo Temple.
Well, and it's funny because as we've rebuilt the Nauvoo Temple, we bought a Catholic school, I believe it was.
I know.
Next door. So it's funny how that switched around.
Well, Nauvoo became a Catholic community. Still is. Predominantly a Catholic community, traditionally. But there were other reasons why we were interested in watching what happened to those temples. Ammon W. Babbitt, who was a recalcitrant stake president in Kirtland, and a barrister, an attorney. He had his eyes on reestablishing the church in Kirtland in the late 1830s, contrary to the will of the First Presidency. Wow. And so long as that Kirtland Temple stayed there, it would be a kind of a magnet for members of the church to move there, which was exactly what the church didn't want in the 1840s. Didn't want the church to gather to Kirtland, but to gather to Nauvoo. So there may have been some other reasons why the church was interested in selling off the Kirtland Temple, because it represented our past, not our future. And the same can be said about the Nauvoo Temple, because William Smith, the brother of the prophet Joseph Smith, felt that there was argument over what belonged to the church, which belonged to the Smith family. William Smith joined with James Strang. You probably heard of James Strang, who was one of the...
Go ahead and just tell a little bit.
James Strang was one of the claimants to succession to the leadership of the church after Joseph Smith's death. And he made a claim which was far more persuasive than Sidney Rigdon's claim ever was. James Strang, that the church should move to Wisconsin, not to the far west. And there he received alleged revelation to build a temple and to find new plates and to translate into the book of the law of the Lord, it's called. So he made this major claim, and he tried desperately to get a hold of the Nauvoo Temple. And the last thing the church wanted was for somebody else to get a hold of that temple, which has led to some suspicion through the years that the church torched their own temple, something like the German Graf Spee, that German battleship in South America that was scuttled by the Germans themselves, that we did the same thing. Well, there's no real evidence for that. There's no evidence at all for that. But we were very concerned that it not fall into the hands of enemies of the church.
So it sounds like we were concerned that it would fall into schismatic Mormons as well.
Well, exactly right. And so we didn't torch our own temple, but we didn't shed a whole lot of tears over the destruction of the temple by that cyclone. It kind of solved some problems for us, although we never got any remuneration for all the time and effort we put into it. And so it wasn't really a factor in the finances. The thing that really financed the Exodus was the United States government in the form of the Mormon Battalion, in requesting the Mormon Battalion to march to San Diego or wherever they told them they're going to be marching to California. And they paid a lot of money for that, some $22,000 to the families, individuals and their wives and families, who in turn contributed and donated most of that money, not all of it, but most of that money to Brigham Young at winter quarters to help fund the Exodus. So we owe the United States government something, don't we?
We talk a lot about how the United States government hated Mormons, but that's interesting to hear that they helped us so much.
Well, they did. And I shouldn't say it was the only or even the largest factor in our finances. The tithing of the church membership in England and the United States, Canada, was a very important factor, but we desperately needed the funds. And another interesting sideline, we think of Missouri as being the great enemy of the church, and it was, of course, in the 1830s, the expulsion by the government or Governor Boggs and what have you. But as we were moving west, many of the saints went down into Missouri on side trips to work for the season, whatever that might be, building fences, harvesting crops. And we have an interesting paradox that Missouri saved the church heading west in 1846, 47.
Wow. Well, we're going to have schedule another interview. I can tell I'm going to take way too much time. In fact, I will tell you this. The secession crisis is another topic that I want to talk about. So I may have to reschedule you for another interview for that. So, all right. Well, let's go back to Kirtland a little bit. So the Kirtland Temple was, and I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the numbers very well, but it was incredibly expensive, especially for a group of poor saints. Can you put to, kind of an idea of, in maybe today's dollars, what the Kirtland Temple would have cost the saints back in 1830s?
The cost of the Kirtland Temple?
Yeah. Do you know?
Yes, we know that in terms of contemporary dollars, 1836 dollars, for the property and for the materials and for the construction, somewhere approximately $40,000. We know that looking at what that would be today, you're looking approximately at a 50 to 1 ratio in terms of the dollar equivalency.
50 to 1. So that's like $200,000 today, or more than that.
$2 million.
$2 million. Oh, wow.
Which I think is kind of a conservative estimate, because a lot of it was donated labor. You know, there was a lot of tithing labor. Sometimes men would contribute 1 in 10 days tithing. Yes. They would work the other 9 days, of course, and get paid for it. Many of them would, of course. So I think that's a conservative figure.
Okay.
I don't think it's ever been fully plumbed what the total cost is, but it would be in the millions of dollars for a church which had very little money.
Yeah, that's for sure. You know, there's a story about that the saints used to crush up their china to make plaster on the temple. Is that a true story, or?
No, that's not a true story.
Okay.
That's one of those Mormonisms that have come through somewhere along the line. There's no question that they sacrificed to build that temple, as did the sisters. And they sacrificed in many, many ways, whether it was, boarding workers or cleaning clothes or mending clothes or all kinds of things. But that story about mixing the crockery and everything else to make that beautiful, shiny outside veneer of the temple, we really don't have any firm evidence for that. Nevertheless, it was a beautiful bluish tinge to it, and that would shine in the sun. The rising sun, the setting sun, because it is on a hill, the Kirtland Temple. Although there's all kinds of forestry around it today, I don't know whether that was there then, but it was considered to be a beautiful structure at the time.
Well, that's great. So the Kirtland Temple, as I understand it, but you're the expert here, so please correct me if I'm wrong. It seems to me it served more of almost a tabernacle purpose. It was more of a meeting place than, say, our modern temples. Could you comment on that?
Well, let me first comment on who I think are the best scholars on this topic. I've already mentioned Locke Mackay on the Community of Christ. I would also add Mark Staker, who works for the Church History Library, who has his most recent work on Nauvoo, on Kirtland, Hearken All Ye People, is a remarkable study. And he talks much...
Trying to interview him, but he hasn't...
He talks much about the Kirtland Temple, does a beautiful job in doing it. Let's see. Do you want to close that? Is that making noise for you? Yeah, okay. The Heavens Resound by Milt Bachman is a remarkable book and study. Milt is now deceased, but his work on the temple. Marvin Hill, Larry Wimmer, their economic study of Kirtland. There's some other great scholars, much greater than I would pretend to be. Although I've learned quite a bit recently about the Kirtland Temple in the last several years, so I just wanted to mention who I consider to be some of the better scholars.
Okay, I appreciate that. I will definitely contact them, see if I can talk with them.
Now, your question was?
It was more of a meeting place than, the Nauvoo Endowment didn't obviously exist, and the Kirtland Endowment was just being begun. They didn't do baptism for the dead. So it seems to me it was more of a meeting place, kind of like our Salt Lake Tabernacle now. Is that a true statement?
Yes, in some ways, it definitely was a meeting house. There was no chapel in Kirtland. There was no chapel in Nauvoo. We were building temples long before we built chapels. So yes, it was an assembly place, but it wasn't always just open for anybody. There were very selective meetings, particularly for priesthood brethren, that weren't open for everybody. usually for those who are about to serve on missions or had special commissions of one kind or another for special meetings. They weren't like every Sunday we're all going to meet there. They would have some of those general meetings from time to time, but it was really very selective in who was able to attend some of those meetings.
So I understand when the mummies were brought to Kirtland, and then Joseph Smith and the church purchased them, that they actually displayed those in the temple, and I believe charged admission.
Yes, they obtained those mummies in 1835.
Okay.
And there's no question that Joseph Smith had begun the interpretation of what we now have as the Book of Abraham in Kirtland. And Kerry Muhlstein's work on this is very pioneering, I should say, to show that the impact on the Kirtland Temple of the Book of Abraham has yet to be really evaluated and ascertained and plumbed. We know it had quite a bit of significance in the Nauvoo endowment, but there seems to be clear evidence now that Joseph Smith's translation of the papyri in Kirtland had an impact on the Kirtland Temple.
You're giving me a lot of good leads here. This is great.
Yeah, Kerry Muhlstein has done some fine work on that. He's on our faculty. He and I are doing some work together. So, yeah, they were shown. The Smith family took possession of them, or at least, shall we say, they were owned by the church, but the Smith family kind of took care of them and would invite people to come and see them, not just in the temple, but at the Smith home for maybe 25 cents to come and see.
Yeah, if I remember right, I believe Joseph Smith Sr. was actually one of the tour guides for those.
Yeah, they, you might call them the curators.
Okay.
And they did that clear through to Nauvoo, too.
Okay. So I think that would just be really surprising because our temples are much more closed now than it seems like.
Well, it wasn't just in the temples. But no, the temples, you didn't necessarily have to have a recommend for the Kirtland Temple. But for many of those meetings, you had to be invited to come.
Okay.
Other times, it was a Sunday meeting, Sunday morning meeting or Sunday evening meetings. They had to come and sing and have you. It would be kind of like a chapel that way. It was ambidextrous in the sense that it was both for the public and for private.
So as I understand it, at the time they referred it to as the endowment, but we'd probably more call it the initiatory or the washings and anointings. Do you know about the evolution of that in Kirtland? Was that right away the temple started, or was that after?
The development of the Kirtland Endowment is a progressive one. It doesn't come immediately. Joseph seemed to indicate something was coming, and it created an anticipation of something special in the Kirtland Temple, and to coordinate with its dedication in April of 1836. But even before that, there were what they would call special washings and anointings, and washing of the feet as well, which began in the Newell K. Whitney store and eventually migrated into the Kirtland Temple. So there were a series of what we today call preliminary ordinances that were given to priesthood holders for preparation for going on missions and as a blessing and a benediction for having worked so hard on the temple. I think there's a tendency in Mormon history to dismiss the Kirtland endowments as merely preliminary. I think we do ourselves a disservice. I think it was foundational for what's going to happen. You can look at the 1836 vision of Elijah, the Savior, Moses, Elijah, and Moses as a great endowment, foundational to the history of the church. I like to see Kirtland as not just an early beginning, but a true foundation to everything that's going to happen in temple work. Certainly Wilford Woodruff saw it that way. He saw it as, wow, this is church changing. This is so fundamental when he first comes to the Kirtland Temple.
If my memory's correct, I think some of the Whitmer brothers, were they opposed to some of these newer revelations about temple worship and things like that? Or maybe my memory's not correct on that. Do you know anything about that?
Well, you're talking about John Whitmer?
Yeah.
There's a wonderful new book out on John Whitmer. It's called The Eighth Witness. And it'll come to me in a minute who the author of that one is. I just lent it to someone. Ron Romig.
Oh, okay.
Of the Community of Christ. Mm-hmm. And yes, the Whitmers didn't quite keep up with the changing evolutionary doctrines of the temple, but very, very instrumental in Far West, in the settlement of Far West, and that's where they left the church. But Whitmers really do not play much of a part of the church in Nauvoo. But they certainly did in Kirtland and in Far West.
Okay. So back in 2011, Elder Bednar gave a talk about temple work, and one of the things that he cited was the vision of Elijah in 1836. It was kind of a surprise to me to discover, because that vision was actually secret for about 40 years, as I recall, and it wasn't revealed. A lot of times we think that, this is the way it's always been done, and so it's interesting to me about how sacred and secret, I guess, in a sense, that revelation was for some 40 years.
Yeah, I've written on
a lot of people didn't know about it. Can you talk a little bit about that vision?
You're talking about the vision in April 1836 of the Savior.
The sealing power, because that's the one.
Elias,
April 3rd.
Moses.
Yeah, I think it was April 3rd, 1836. Three appeared and gave the sealing power. And in Elder Bednar's talk, one of the things that he said was, when we think of the sealing power, at least myself, I think of husband and wife being sealed together. But in Elder Bednar's talk, he mentioned how we were being sealed back to our ancestors. And I think it was right before that Joseph had a vision of Alvin, and surprised that Alvin was in the celestial kingdom and baptism for the dead. Although even there was no font in Kirtland in 1836. And so the evolution of baptism for the dead really didn't happen until Nauvoo, but the foundations, as you said, were laid in Nauvoo. And so it's really interesting to me to see how, I guess, rudimentary things were in Nauvoo, and a lot of these visions that we take for granted today, the vision of Elijah, weren't very well known, especially in relation to temple work. Could you comment on that?
This is a classic case in church history of what I would call the Reclamation of Revelation. And in 1876, under the specific direction of Orson Pratt, many earlier revelations that were given in the history of the church, including Section 110, which you're referring to, but not just 110. Section 109, which is the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. Section 121, 122, 123, the Liberty Jail revelations. Sections 2 and 13, the Moroni and John the Baptist revelation. Section 132, the plural marriage, the celestial marriage section, were finally put in the Doctrine and Covenants and canonized in 1876 by membership vote. It was a reclamation of these earlier revelations which we had come to really begin to see after 40 years. Those are extremely important. And we reclaimed them. That they were always there, but they were never canonized. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it set a precedent for the church. In 1976, Spencer W. Kimball, looking back to Section 138 today, our Section 138, the great dream and vision of Joseph F. Smith back in 1918, it took us, almost 60 years to catch on to the significance of that? You could ask the question, why did we wait so long to reclaim such a powerful revelation? I remember reading that in the book called Gospel Doctrine, which was a collection of Joseph F. Smith's great sermons, and wondering, why isn't that in the Doctrine and Covenants? And I'm sure others thought the same. Well, President Kimball looked back in the rest of the 12 with the keys of the revelation, saying, that revelation is foundational to what we have to do now. And so they reclaimed it and put it at first in the Pearl of Great Price, if you recall, and then later in the Doctrine and Covenants in Section 137, 138, Alvin's, same thing, Alvin's vision, Joseph Smith's vision of Alvin. So this idea of looking back to our history often leads to a reclamation of revelation. which doesn't deny the significance and the validity of the original revelation whatsoever, but it indicates how the Spirit of the Lord moves and said, that, you better write it down. It reminds me in the Book of Mormon when Christ comes to the Nephites and he says, did I not tell you, did not Samuel prophesy that there would be many that would rise from the dead? Remember that? And Nephi's kind of shocked. He says, oh yeah, he did say that. And Savior said, well, why didn't you write it down? Remember? It's right there in 3rd Nephi. Write it down. And okay, we'll go down and write it down. That was the Reclamation of Revelation. And that really is it opens a great topic in church history about why studying our history is so important, because sometimes we miss things. And I think you're referring to here, section 110 and these other revelations is a wonderful, Elder Bednar makes a great point of it. These sealing keys were extremely important. They were written all down by Warren Cowdery. Joseph and Oliver didn't write it down. Warren Cowdery wrote it down. Joseph never refers to that revelation, if you want to know the truth, although he talks a lot about the substance of it. But it's not until Orson Pratt in 76, under the direction of the president of the church, of course, we better get that down.
Why do you think it has taken so long? I mean, decades to get some of these foundational revelations.
I don't know. But I think it's like a person's childhood. You look back sometimes and you say, you know, that was an experience that changed my life. I better give more importance to that. I better write that thing down. And when I'm writing my family history, that thing really, that person really changed my life. Or, you know, in retrospect, Revelation is also retrospective, not just prophetic. It's also looking back. And I think that's what happened. And that's what continues to happen sometimes. We look back. And wouldn't surprise me, Rick, for a moment, if we were to go back and say, you know, that proclamation on the family given by President Hinckley back there in 92 or whatever it was, that should go in our Doctrine and Covenants. That was revelation. It wouldn't surprise me for a moment. We'd have to go buy some new Doctrine and Covenants. And here we go again. But it's a living church. It's a discovery. It's discovering all the time from our past as well as our future.
Well, I'll tell you what I think, that they should put in the Doctrine and Covenants as a new revelation. If you read the official Declaration 1, it's very businesslike, very governmental. But if you read the footnote, Wilford Woodruff says, I had a vision. I'm like, why are we not emphasizing the vision? I'd like to know more about that vision. Even with official Declaration 2, I'd like to know more about that revelation with priesthood. Yeah. Are there any other revelation? There's one about, was it Lorenzo Snow that saw Jesus in the temple, in the Salt Lake Temple? I might have the prophet wrong. Do you know what I'm referring?
Yeah, that's...
So, I would love to see these sorts of things in the Doctrine and Covenants, and we need another Orson Pratt, I guess, to help us write these down, I guess.
Well, we have wonderful prophetic leaders today who, when inspired, will, if necessary, make all the reclamations that we need and all the modern emphases that we need. We do believe in revelation, right? Past, present, and future. We believe all that God has revealed. Oh, we didn't quite understand why that was so important. We do now, and He's revealing it today, just like the Savior said, did I not tell you? Write that down. It doesn't make the church any less true. In fact, it makes it more viable.
Well, that's great. One last thing in Nauvoo, in Kirtland, but it happened in Nauvoo. There are a lot of Mormon journals that talk about people who spoke in tongues. That's not something we do now. That's kind of another evolution. What are your thoughts about speaking in tongues in the days of Kirtland and the evolution to why that's not really something that happens anymore?
Well, it's still a key on the piano. We've never denied the possibility of speaking in tongues. I think it goes back to Joseph Smith's caution on abuse of the speaking of tongues, which he gave in Nauvoo, actually. There are a lot of manifestations of speaking in tongues in Kirtland. We know that. There were several in Nauvoo as well. But there were many joining the church who were kind of, excessive in it. And Joseph felt that that was, of all the gifts, probably the one most easily abused. And I think that imprinted on Brigham Young's mind as well. Brigham Young spoke in tongues many times. When they got out here in the valley, they spoke in tongues. But it's just gradually been not replaced, but that other gifts have been emphasized more than the gift of tongues. Gifts which seem to reflect more our temple worship and our reverence of certain gifts. That gift of tongues is really not associated so much with temple worship. We have certain gifts in temples, especially discernment and recognition of the Spirit, that aren't easily duplicated. And so I think that the rise of temple work kind of moved some of these other gifts to the sideline.
Okay.
That makes sense?
Yeah. So since you mentioned Brigham Young, one of the things I was reviewing was there was a lot of different music, and they used to dance inside the temple. I was reading that Brigham Young said the temple was a holy place, and when we danced unto the Lord. And I thought, well, we don't dance in temples anymore. I think this was after a wedding. There had been a big wedding celebration in there. And it says here, the sisters retired to the side rooms, the brethren stretched themselves on the floor or on the sofas, and we were all soon in the embraces of a tired nature's sweet restorer, balmy sleep. They actually fell asleep in the Nauvoo temple. Yeah. So it just, as I think about my experience at the temple, they're very different. So can you talk a little bit, what do you think about those differences that, the Nauvoo days and what our temple worship today?
There's no question that they danced unto the Lord in the Nauvoo temple. You don't see that so much in the Kirtland Temple. But in the Nauvoo temple, as they were preparing to move west, there was this great push that let's have as many as possible receive their endowment, even though the temple isn't dedicated yet. And so there were 5,500 people received their endowment in the Nauvoo temple before they left, between the 10th of December and the end of January. And they were giving them round the clock. Brigham Young particularly was the one in charge, because Joseph is gone by now, and the 12 holds these keys of sealing, which Joseph had bestowed upon them. They were exhausted, but they wanted to bless their people, particularly those who had labored on the temple, and particularly those who had given so much in Missouri and in Kirtland, who had never received their endowment before, these great blessings. And I think they celebrated. There was a spirit of celebration and a spirit of anticipation. They're heading west. There wasn't the formalization like we have today of the very formal, very specific things to receive in the temple. There it was a celebration. We finished this. All but finished it anyway. Let's enjoy it. Let's make a joyful noise unto the Lord, and let's dance and praise the Lord. We can do this. And that's how they interpreted the scriptures. Anciently, they did the same sort of thing. And so under prophetic direction, they did. And they sang and they danced, and they had public meetings, some of them. And it wasn't quite the same as our temple. You got to see, it was more in some ways like the Kirtland Temple. It was more open too. So they weren't trespassing in anything sacred. They were expressing some sacred feelings in a brand new setting, in a spirit of celebration that we don't quite have the same feeling today. We're not leaving Salt Lake, or if we all were heading out to Australia somewhere, this is the last time we're going in the Nauvoo Temple or the Salt Lake Temple, we might do something similar. Let's have a special finale, and I think that's what they were doing.
Well, that's cool. So it was in Nauvoo that we got a lot more of the temple ordinances that we're more familiar with. We got baptism for the dead, although I guess the first baptisms for the dead were done actually in the Missouri and the Mississippi River, because the Nauvoo temple wasn't completed. We also got the full Nauvoo endowment, whereas it was more of the preparatory things in Kirtland. Can you talk about the evolution from Kirtland to Nauvoo as far as temple worship happened and ordinances?
That's a big topic. Which ordinance you want to talk about? Baptism for the dead?
Sure, we'll start with baptism for the dead.
Well, the saints, started building a temple in Far West and dedicated a spot in Endowment too. Brigham Young did, for the building of a temple. To the best of my understanding, those temples, had they been built, would have been very much, and the Jackson County Independence Temple, had those temples been built, they would have replicated much of what you saw in Kirtland. One of the key developments between what happened in Far West, or shall we say in Kirtland, Far West, and Nauvoo was going to be the experience in Liberty Jail. And this experience of the saints who are being driven east from Far West to Quincy in Illinois in 1839. This period is extremely difficult for the saints. They're being driven out by order of the governor. Where are they going to go? Joseph Smith's in jail. And Joseph Smith receives several wonderful revelations in that jail temple of what we call Liberty Jail, in preparation for what's going to happen, including sections 121, 122, and 123, which were reclaimed again, put in 1876. But as you read Joseph Smith's letters and study his life and his revelations in that period of time, we're talking what? Approximately 6 months in the winter of 1838 and 39. He's a transformed prophet. He's not the same coming out as he was going in. There's an awful lot that he learns in this period of time, in this time out period, that has a great impact on the Nauvoo temple ordinances. One of which is going to be baptism for the dead. The origin of baptism for the dead is a mystery. We don't know where and when Joseph actually comes to grips with this ordinance. We know that back in Kirtland, that revelation that he had, that vision of Alvin, we know that it happened, and where he wonders how it is that Alvin is in the celestial kingdom and he had never been baptized. Was this the opening bell of baptisms for the dead? Many scholars think so. Guy Bishop, one of the fine scholars, argues this point, and so do others, that, wow, how is it that he got in the celestial kingdom and he was never baptized? Well, there had to be, baptism still had to be performed. Was that one of the foundation points for baptism for the dead? Possibly. When Joseph Smith escapes from Liberty Jail, they come to Quincy, and then up they go the river, up to the Mississippi. And in the summer of 39, as you recall, what's happening to the saints that are trying to settle in commerce? Well, if you know your history, there's an awful lot of sickness and death. Some 60 die that summer alone in Nauvoo. And
that was because of malaria, the malaria outbreak, is that right?
And the river-borne infestations and what have you, the swamps and what have you. And eventually even Joseph Smith Sr. is going to die, but he comes down sick in 39. Don Carlos is going to die in 40, his brother, Joseph's brother. Several others are going to die. The statement at the Seymour Brunson funeral in August of 1840, it's coming out of a context of death. The great exodus east from Far West to Quincy, and so many became sick and died out of this. Far more so, frankly, than we've given credit for. When Joseph, interestingly enough, gives this revelation on baptism for the dead, it's at a funeral. And there were many who were dying. And so there's this context of death. And where do we go for an answer to this scepter of death? And that's in that context where Joseph Smith will reveal the baptism for the dead a salvific response to the horrific deaths that are occurring. Where and when that began, we don't know, but it is pronounced and announced in that kind of a context.
Now, as I recall, Alvin, did he die at about 1823? Is that
Yeah, he dies in 23.
So, if my memory is correct, Joseph had the first vision in 1820. He's going through. Alvin was a big supporter of Joseph's prophetic gift, and then he died. What I understand is from bilious colic, is what they called it back in the day, and they gave him some mercury to cure him, which ended up killing him. The cure was worse than the disease in that case.
That was often the case.
Yeah.
Bleeding, bloodletting, things like that, kill more people than anything.
Yeah. Well, what I understand was, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe might have been a...
Excuse me.
No, you're fine. It might have been a Presbyterian minister who said that, Alvin was never baptized, so he's going to hell. And so that offended Joseph Smith Sr., and so that was one of the reasons why he never joined with any of those Protestant churches. Are you familiar with that story, or am I getting it right?
No, you got it right. William Smith speaks of this.
Okay.
William Smith is our source for this, the brother of Joseph Smith. Richard Bushman speaks abundantly of this in his book, Rough Stone Rolling. Sam Brown, Dr. Sam Brown, in his work on early death in Mormonism, speaks of this in a beautiful study. Yeah, the Presbyterian minister saying that Alvin had lost his soul because he had died without these blessings and ordinances did not go very well with Joseph Smith Sr. It's reasonable to suppose that this was a factor, but it's impossible to prove that. It is certain, though, that Joseph Smith Sr. himself is sick and dying in 1839, before Joseph Smith reveals baptism for the dead. And he dies within days or a few weeks of the announcement. And Joseph Smith is clearly thinking about his father and perhaps of Alvin. So you wouldn't want to dismiss this as immediate factors for it. But you can't say for certainty yet. We haven't found anything yet where Joseph Smith says, well, this is where I came up with this idea. It was a process of revelation. We talked about the reclamation of revelation. We have to think about the progression of revelation too. What is the answer to the Hans Mill massacre? Joseph now is not just leading a church. People are dying for his religion. The ante goes up in his mind. It's one thing to believe in what I'm telling you, but people are now giving their lives for it. The Missouri conflict and conflagration, all those who died, the sickness, the death, David Patton, all the rest, those young boys and men at Hans Mill. Well, what's my answer to this? What's the Lord's answer to this? And I think Joseph was asking the Lord very carefully. He said, we're having a H of a time. What are the answers to this? And I think that's where you have to see baptism for the dead coming out of a much bigger context.
These are wonderful insights. It's fascinating. Let's turn over to the endowment. As I understand it, Masonry actually played a big role in the Nauvoo endowment. I know a lot of those Masonic influences have come over the years, and it seems like at first Mormon leaders acknowledged that freely, and then over the years they've kind of been more hesitant to acknowledge that. And actually, I believe it was in 1991, some of those Masonic influences were actually removed. There's still quite a few there. But can you talk about how Masonry influenced the Nauvoo endowment?
How Masonry influenced the Nauvoo endowment. You want a short answer, or do you want a more? There are many scholars who have written on this. Another one named Matt Brown and Hogan, I forget his first name, over the years.
Michael Homer, I believe.
And Homer, yeah. But I'm talking Hogan has written a lot of this. Okay. there are some obvious similarities between the Nauvoo Endowment and the Masonry ceremony. I think going back in history, you have to look at the red brick store, which Joseph Smith opened as a store, January the 6th, 1842. He was a storekeeper, but he never was much a storekeeper. I don't know how he ever got into that. But anyway, it's that the red brick store is also going to double as a Masonic hall, because a lot of people in Nauvoo were Masons. Masonry was very, very popular at that time. Anyone who was anybody would join the Masons. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, all the rest of them. It was just the thing to be, a Mason. And so many Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo are joining the Masons for benevolent purposes. The Mason lodges are very benevolent, taking care of the widow and the family in the time of death, and there was a lot of death. And so one of the reasons why the Masonry is becoming important is to be a support for the poor and the indigent. It's starting at the same time as the Relief Society, which has started at that same place for the women, which I think is significant, that the Nauvoo Endowment is not going to be closed to women. One of the fundamental differences between what happened in the Nauvoo Temple and the Kirtland Temple is that the Nauvoo Temple is very, very significantly involved for women. Masonry never was. Certainly wasn't at that time. Isn't today for many of their things. And so a big difference right away is who's going to receive the endowment. The signs and symbols that you sometimes see in the temple, whether they're the all-seeing eye or the geometric symbols, have some similarity to Masonry. There's no question about that. Maybe even some of the clothing would have some parallels. But Joseph Smith explained that he did it, that he may have borrowed some of it, but for an entirely different reason. Something that they were somewhat familiar with, but for an entirely different reason. To the best of my knowledge, the differences are very, very stark when it comes to scriptural and prophetic and Christian. Masonry is a benevolent and wonderful society, but it's not necessarily closed just to Christians. It's not a religion. The scriptural emphasis on the Nauvoo Endowment fundamentally different than what you see there. Although they use the same terms as lodges, they have a celestial lodge even in Masonry, and some people will dismiss it right away and say, "Oh, it's just a perversion of Masonry." And Joseph Smith does make some comparisons, but it's a religious devotion, not a benevolent expression.
Well, and as I understand it,
in the sense of the Masons.
The Masons, supposedly, as the story goes, that they were Masons of of King Solomon's temple, and that the temple ceremony supposedly dates from those days, although I believe that's historically that's not true. But as the story is told of Hiram Abiff, I'd seen some of the temple ceremonies, but those aprons that they have are like they're for like a stonemason, like you would use it. Whereas in the LDS endowment, they have they have more of a ceremonial, scriptural thing. So the purpose is completely different. So there's some really significant changes that Joseph made.
The covenants are significantly different. Very, very different. No, I would not to trespass upon the sacred precincts of the endowment, but from a Latter-day Saint perspective, the endowment is more Christian than it is Masonic, and it's certainly more Abrahamic than it is Masonic. It owes much, I believe, as many scholars could point to this, that Joseph Smith's work in the Book of Abraham had a major impact on the development of the endowment. But it's also based on Joseph Smith's progressive understanding of eternal progression and eternal improvement. And it leads to one of the other great ordinances, and that's eternal marriage, which is nothing to do with Masonic.
Yes, that's exactly where I was going to go next.
I mean, baptism for the dead, if you're looking at the ordinances of the temple, baptism for the dead, which is salvific, based for those who have died, endowments for the living and eventually for the dead, and marriages for eternity have nothing to do with Masonry at all. But some of the trappings might be similar.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit about the sealing ordinance. And I'm trying not to step anywhere I'm not supposed to when we talk about these. But as I understand it, I think it was Brian Hales has said that I originally believed in Nauvoo that the temple ordinances were only for the living, although I believe Brian Hales has said that they did seal some, usually like maybe Alvin to Joseph Sr., and some of those, so some of the participants were dead, or some of the participants by proxy were dead. Some of them were living in Nauvoo, but primarily most of the sealing to spouses and to mother and child were primarily living people. Is that correct? And then,
well, baptism for the dead was all for the dead.
Yeah, but as far as sealing,
endowments for the living in Nauvoo, and sealings, the great preponderance of in a marriage circumstance of a woman or women being sealed to a man. There were a very few examples of deceased children being sealed to those families, but that doesn't really play much of a part in Nauvoo, but it kind of laid a foundation for it. But yeah, living sealings, living marriages.
Yeah, so it was primarily, there was not really very much work for the dead in Nauvoo, other than baptisms for the dead.
Of which there were thousands.
Okay.
And like you said earlier, they began first in the temple, in the river, and then eventually in the wooden font in November of 41, which Brigham Young dedicates, and then eventually that's replaced by the actual font in the Nauvoo Temple. So, I mean, baptisms for the dead is a very big thing in that Nauvoo Temple, which had nothing in Kirtland like that.
Okay. So, and I understand that originally that, like Elijah Abel, I believe, was baptized on behalf of his mother, because back then they didn't really have all those rules, and I believe it was Brigham Young who changed it and said, no, you need to be the same gender for the person you're being baptized for.
That's right. But going back to baptism for the dead, Joseph Smith in section 128, in one of his talks there in Nauvoo, which was later canonized, talks about baptism for the dead being the linkage between generations. Remember this? He talks about it as the great link. Well, baptism for the dead isn't a sealing in that sense. You know, we never think of a baptism for the dead as a sealing, but he talked about it as the great link of families. And so you can't dismiss baptism for the dead as something that wasn't a sealing. In Joseph's mind, baptism for the dead is more than just doing the ordinance for that person. It's a linkage of the generations in some way that I think needs to be further explored in our doctrine and our history, and kind of lay the foundation for the later doctrines of sealing generations one to another. But it all starts with this foundational ordinance of baptism for the dead. There's a sealing emphasis on that. Elijah.
Yeah, well, that kind of goes back to Elder Bednar's talk.
It goes back to Elder Bednar's talk.
He talked about that.
But you don't think of that baptism for the dead as an ordinance of sealing to the family. That's something else. But you couldn't have sealings of one generation to the other without baptism for the dead. So you have to see it as a foundational cornerstone to the later doctrine of sealing. You see what I mean? Which I think needs to be further explored in our history. I think that's an area that we could explore further, the doctrine of sealing of the dead in baptisms for the dead, sealing of families.
Yeah. So one other topic I want to talk about while we're still kind of in Nauvoo is the law of adoption. That's always been something I haven't understood very well. Is that something can you talk us about the law of adoption?
The law of adoption. You mean the sealing of a person to a general authority. You're talking about that on law of adoption.
Yes. Why did they do that in the first place?
A fascinating question. I don't think you can talk about the law of adoption without understanding the development of the doctrine of the spirit world. Mm-hmm. and the doctrine of the gospel being taught in the spirit world, which really doesn't come to fruition in our doctrine, in our history, until Joseph Smith's great revelation, 1918, and what was going on in the spirit world. But it's a progressive doctrine about the souls of men and women that are living in the spirit world. Are they being reclaimed? Are they being taught the gospel? Are they being converted? Are they being forgiven? Are they receiving the fullness of the gospel there? Baptism for the dead opened that door to actually begin to do ordinances for the dead. But could we be sealed to our ancestors? Like we do today, we take it so for granted, they're just being sealed to your ancestors. Well, if they're not receiving the gospel, we wouldn't want to take the risk of being sealed to them, because what's going to happen to us if they don't accept the gospel? Until it became clear that the fullness of the gospel was being taught to them, the deceased, and that they were receiving the fullness of the ordinances, better be on the safe side and be sealed to a living prophet or a deceased prophet, maybe like Joseph Smith, and we'll be sealed until we know more clearly what's going to happen. Let's be sealed to the prophetic priesthood lineage of the prophet Joseph, the priesthood claim, and therefore it's a done deal. Can I use that term? It's a safer way. Then we don't know what's happening to our ancestors. That's going to change as we learn better and more clearly, especially in 1877 with Wilford Woodruff, when he announces that from now on we're going to do endowments for the dead. See, we don't begin to do endowments for the dead until 1877. That's 40 years after Nauvoo, 30 years after Nauvoo. And the great significance of that is, you mean to tell me that they're receiving the fullness of priesthood blessings in their receiving their endowments there? It isn't just accepting the gospel, they're receiving the fullness of the gospel with all the priesthood blessings? Well, yes, that's what Woodruff manifests. He says they are. Therefore, we should be sealed to the priesthood that they hold, and not anymore to this other way of doing it, which was this roundabout safer way. Now we recognize the doctrine of the spirit world in reclamation and teaching the gospel. You see, you have to explore how that spirit world redemption doctrine reaches the point that now we can do endowments for the dead.
Well, that's interesting, because as I understand it, in the 1840s especially, a lot of people joined the church and their families were very opposed to their baptism in the Mormon church. And so a lot of people felt like, well, they're not going to accept the God, the same spirit which exists now, it's going to be in the next world. And so I don't want to risk being sealed to somebody who's antagonistic to the gospel. And so I'm going to be sealed to Joseph or Brigham.
And how unpopular the church was. And they knew that from their families, that they were ridden out of town over this, and their families turned them out of doors. And they don't have a hope in heaven of ever joining this church. I mean, you mean to tell me that when they die that we not only do baptisms for the dead, but that they're going to have a whole turn of heart? I mean, a whole disposition change to receive all of this? And it took a while for us to reach that point. It's one of these progressive doctrines. Right?
Well, and so it sounds to me, because you're going right where I wanted to go with Wilford Woodruff and St. George. So, I mean, tell me if this is correct understanding. So in Nauvoo, you had people who were worried their parents weren't going to be sealed, or weren't going to accept the church, and so they didn't want to be sealed to them, so they tried to tie into a general authority line.
Yeah, that's what happened.
And then as we came west, and St. George was the first temple completed here in Utah. So Wilford Woodruff was the first St. George Temple president. So as he's taking over as president, the thought process kind of changed. And I don't know if it was Wilford Woodruff who said this, but somehow we changed the mindset from, I'm not sure if they're going to convert, to, you know what, everybody's going to accept the gospel in the next world. Is that a correct portrayal of what happened?
I don't think it was ever understood that everyone would accept it. They all have their agency. But everyone would have the opportunity to accept it. Acceptance isn't the right word. Acceptance is just opening the door to actually living it. There would have to be the same ordinances and the same change of heart that would occur in the spirit world existence as it did here. It would have to be repentance and the whole process of salvation in that situation. So acceptance is just part of it. It's actually undergoing this mighty change in their lives, in their spirit world existence, which we came to understand fully, more fully at least, in 1918 with Joseph F. Smith and his great vision of the dead.
So we were talking a little bit about the law of adoption, St. George, and so how long, I guess, did that continue happening in St. George?
Wilford Woodruff signals the end of it to begin to end it as early as 1877, but he wasn't president of the church until much later. When his revelation of 1893, 1894 ends it, when he says we will no longer do such adoptions in the temples, and he instructs the temple presidents, the 4 temple presidents at that time, Salt Lake, Manti, St. George, and Logan, to desist from any more adoptions. And so it ends then in 1893-94 with the statement from President Wilford Woodruff. It never sat well with him. The whole idea that wasn't quite clear. And especially after they begin to do endowments for the dead, he recognizes, oh no, we're not going to do this anymore. It's with our families. So, but during its heyday, I don't know how many hundreds of people were sealed to the Joseph Smith, in that form of the law of adoption, and to Brigham Young and Willard Richards and John Taylor and many of the general authorities.
So, and as I understand it, John D. Lee was sealed to Brigham Young as a son, right?
Yeah,
even though he was older. Wasn't he older than Brigham Young?
It didn't make any difference. It was a spiritual adoption, in return in which they would do physical things for the family to help. It had a social aspect to it. In fact, much of the 1847 migrations, and 48 migrations too, of the saints, are built around this concept of tribal families. Brigham Young's family with all of his real children and adopted spiritually, all with him, and Willard Richards and Heber C. Kimball, and they're going up by family.
Is this kind of like the 12 tribes of Israel kind of a thing, or is it different than that?
Not so much the 12 tribes, but they were by adopted family. So it has a role for a while.
So you mentioned also something about the endowments for the dead were a reaction to some other things going on in Salt Lake. Could you talk about that?
You're talking about spiritualism?
Yes.
Well, that's only one factor, but it is a factor. Spiritualism, the practice of communing with the dead, adulterated today by Ouija boards and things like this, and telekinesis and paranormal. But spiritualism is well known in American history as flowering after the Civil War, with so many dead and lost, and the great desire of many families to know what happened to their sons or their fathers or their brothers, and how did it happen, and this great desire for resolution, which war does not allow for in many cases, led to many people seeking the dead through spiritualism, which is knocking on tables, spiritual writing from the other side, through seances and what have you. This really kind of flowered in America after the Civil War, and it was a factor in the rise of the Godbyite movement. William S. Godby and some of his intellectual friends from England who broke with Brigham Young over his economic policies, not trading with Eastern merchants and what have you. Brigham Young was very much for, we'll make it ourselves. We'll be self-sustaining. We don't need to deal with the Eastern merchants. All of which flowers after the coming of the railroad. All this new merchandise and the economics. Economics, as Leonard Arrington in his great book, Great Basin Kingdom, is a factor in a lot of our doctrines, a lot of our organizations. And so the Godbeite movement is an economic negative reaction to Brigham Young. But they have to have a theological underpinning to it, and they fasten on spiritualism. And Amos Lyman, a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, is converted to them and becomes quite an advocate of spiritualism, which really isn't a religion at all. It doesn't believe in the atonement of Christ or anything like that. But it does believe in communing with the dead. In the 1870s, there's a lot of comment by general authorities, leaders of the church, particularly Orson Pratt, about that this is a counterfeit. But it has its place. We understand why people are seeking the dead. Was that a factor in the beginning of endowments for the dead in the church in 1877? I claim that it may have been one of the factors to begin to address how we really believe about this. There is redemption for the dead, but it's not that way. It's another way. So was it a factor? I argue that it probably was one of the factors. The coming of the railroad certainly was a factor. In the re-establishment of the Relief Society in 1867, all the auxiliaries, we needed to have a response to all these new philosophies that are coming down the track. The new religions. Was the building of the St. George Temple in 1877 somewhat a response to that? Maybe. But I think it's a reclamation of much of what we had done in Nauvoo and all the way back to Kirtland. Oh, it's a progression of our theological understanding of temple work. If you're going to have baptisms for the dead, why wouldn't we have endowments for the dead? It's a logical progression in my mind. But it didn't come immediately to the saints. It took a while for that to get there.
Interesting. So was William Godby, was he ever Mormon or?
Oh yeah, he was a very, very strong Latter-day Saint.
I'm not.
There was a coterie, a cluster of intellectuals. Harrison was another one. Trying to think of all the other ones. There were a small number of astute intellectual Latter-day Saints who broke with Brigham Young in the 1870s, who thought they knew the gospel a little bit better than Brigham Young did. But they thought that they knew economics better than Brigham Young did, and they broke with the church with that. The Salt Lake Tribune starts with the Godbeite movement, which was very negative, of course, against the church. It still tends to be a little bit on that side, but that's its history.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, so I guess 1893, Wilford Woodruff, is that one of those revelations that we need to reclaim? As far as getting rid of the law of adoption, and now you're just sealed to your family, as far back as we can trace?
I think that's the doctrine of readjustments. There's reclamation and adjustments, a coming of an understanding. Oh, this is what this means. Okay, we'll do that.
So I would just like a new edition where we've got that revelation in there. I'd love to see that one.
I think it goes back to our 8th article of faith. We believe that all that God has revealed. Now we have to understand that a little better. All that he is revealing and all that he will yet reveal. It's a radical theology.
Yeah.
Revelation could mean radical change. And the manifesto, for instance, of 1890, ending plural marriage, is a radical thing.
That's actually where I wanted to go next. So
maybe revolutionary would be a better term, but you know what I mean. It was not a little thing.
So, because that was a big part. I know you gave a presentation at the Sons of Utah Pioneers a while back, and that was one of the things that struck me was you said, in Wilford Woodruff's mind, there was all these polygamy prosecutions, and it was more important to save the temples, because at that time, what was going on there that we were worried about losing all the temples?
Well, we were losing the temples. over this fight with the United States government on plural marriage, because the church wasn't going to give that up. John Taylor dies in hiding in defense of it. There's no question that plural marriage was a very, very major commitment of the church. And it defined us, and we were commanded to live it. A lot of saints today think, oh, this is just, we're going to stop this. This was a huge deal. Here, I'll read from the official declaration, which is the footnotes to section 2, declaration number 1. Wilford Woodruff says, and I've got other evidences of this in times, other places he said it. He said, the question is this: which is the wisest course for the saints to pursue, Latter-day Saints to pursue? To continue to attempt to practice plural marriage with the laws of the nation against it, and the opposition of 60 million people, and at the cost of the convocation loss of all the temples, and stopping all of the ordinances therein, including endowments for the dead now, both for the living and the dead? Or, after doing and suffering what we have through our adherence to this principle, to cease the practice and submit to the law? What's the wisest course? And the whole question about how Wilford would have reached the conclusion long before this, long before the fight over the United States government and the Evans-Tucker Act and the confiscation of our properties. Well, the wisest course is what we've been doing since Nauvoo, since baptism for the dead, and now endowments for the living in Nauvoo, and now endowments for the dead in St. George. Are we going to give up all this for what you would have to say in his mind was a temporary subset of the law of eternal marriage? If I will command, I will, says the Lord, on plural marriage. If I do command, in other words, it's not a permanent law. Book of Mormon makes that very clear. Wilford would have understood that it has its place at a certain time. But are we going to give up the eternal doctrine of redemption for the dead for a temporary subset of eternal marriage? Which is the wisest course? Was he selling down river Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, John Taylor? Not in his mind. He had received clear revelation that how can we hold on to what they taught and still make a major change? And tremendously courageous to do what he did. And it took a man like Wilford Woodruff because he was bathed in the water of plural marriage, in that sense that he had 5 wives. He'd suffered with all the rest of them to live it day by day, and he wasn't going to give that up for any little thing, you know. But he says he received revelation from the Lord saying, time is up on this one, but redemption for the dead is an eternal law. Temple work is an eternal thing. Plural marriage is a temporary subset of an eternal marriage law, right? Mm-hmm. Very, very important, though. We gave our lives for it, went to prison for it, we fought everything for it. It was a major junction in the history of the church. But did we sell our soul? Did we sell them down the river? Not in Wilford Woodruff's mind. Because even in Brigham Young's mind, they had the full understanding of temple work hadn't developed. Even in Joseph's own mind, it was a line upon line thing. So this is where this has now come. We were doing all these millions of ordinances. Are we going to give all this up for this? What's the wisest course?
Fascinating.
So that's the title of the book I'm doing. Hopefully we'll be done soon.
Well, I will definitely help you sell that book. So it sounds very interesting.
But in a very real sense, let me just say this last thing. Our surrender of plural marriage was in many ways our greatest affidavit to the significance of temple work. Because what you surrender for something else is a testimony of how that something else is so important. And that's how we can reclaim and should understand plural marriage. It was what the Lord asked us to do for that period of time, and a great sacrifice to do it. And to give that up after all that we had gone to prison for is the greatest statement of how significant temple work has become.
Well, and a lot of people had a problem with that because they didn't believe, they believed that plural marriage was more important.
A small number. I think you have to see it. Despite all the problems that we had in surrendering plural marriage, and we did, we had to come up with another manifesto in 1904. And there were break-offs down the road over this whole thing. But it's always a very small number who claim that. The great majority of the church recognized, the time has come, let's move on.
So, looks like 1893, 1894, we've changed from the law of adoption to kind of what we have now.
Actually, it was scaling down long before that. I've gone through all these records. I've seen them. The number of adoptions was declining all through the 70s and 80s. It was not a big thing in the 1890s. It was the death knell in 1893. But the rush was now to family work through the 80s and early 90s. It's hardly even understood amongst many of the church members at that time.
Well, yeah. So my question was, to me, that was pretty big. I mean, even if it was declining, that was kind of a big.
Oh, it was. It was the beginning of the Genealogical Society.
Right.
The whole work of doing work for the dead. Another reason, by the way, for the demise of the law of adoption and the rise of endowments for the dead and everything else was the growth in genealogical societies and genealogical research worldwide. You really have to study that phenomenon about how genealogy becomes a major hobby of a lot of people, and the development of societies worldwide in the 1880s, 1890s. And it has something to do with the wars, but there's this same thing going on worldwide about reclamation of family histories and the availability of records. We didn't have the records that we wanted to have in the 60s and 70s. So only as with the railroad allowing for the quicker movement of records and postage and people being able to get their records, where it is an impetus for this. So there are a lot of things happening outside of just Mormonism, which are factors in all of this equation. Major things.
Interesting. So what are the big, let's use 1890 as kind of our cutoff point. What are the big things that have happened between 1890 and today as far as the temple's concerned? As far, is there anything really?
Change in temples?
So, well, I mean, as far, because...
Not just the growth in numbers of temples, you mean?
Well, yeah, so kind of what I'm looking at, in Kirtland you have you've got the Kirtland Endowment, and then in Nauvoo you've got baptism for the dead, and you've got the Nauvoo Endowment and sealings. St. George, you have, we're getting rid of the law of adoption. Are there any other kind of theological changes going on between 1890 and now?
The doctrine of the gathering. The temples were magnets and were a powerful factor in people gathering from Europe and England to the Rocky Mountains, or originally even to Nauvoo. The saints want to be where the temple is. After 1900 and the beginning of an understanding that we should stay where we are and gather to the local units and gather in your own nations, you begin to see temples now moving out from Utah. I think the first major expression of that would be the Kirtland Temple.
Is that under President McKay?
No, that's back in the 19-teens. It's going to be in Joseph S. Smith's time. I'm trying to remember the exact date of the Kirtland Temple. But to actually build a temple in another country, that the people would gather there, is a signal of changing place of temples as a gathering force for the church in different nations. And of course, the whole story of temples in modern times has been building temples where the saints are, especially under President Hinckley, is they are to gather to the temples in their own nations. President McKay with New Zealand, England, and Swiss temples, the international growth of the church, gathering to in your own nations where the temples are. And you're seeing the temples going to where the people are rather than the people coming to where the temple is. That's a major change in the whole story of the growth of Mormonism.
So you say that started in about 1910?
Certainly with the Kirtland Temple.
Okay. And then the 50s was, I believe, New Zealand, is that right?
56, we're looking at, that was the LA Temple, and then 50, just right around that same time, the New Zealand and the Swiss temples, David O'Mackey. And then it has just compounded ever since. And
then President Hinckley just went like a rocket.
Yes, under President Hinckley, there's no question that the internationalization of the church, President McKay's vision of it, really solidifies it with him, and the taking of the temple to where the people are. But this thing about the gathering, the doctrine of gathering in the temples, goes clear back to Kirtland. That's why they were gathering there, was because of the temple. That's why they gathered to Nauvoo, all the saints coming from England, right? And that's why they're gathering to the Rocky Mountains, because the temple is a very, very... It wasn't only an economic reason for them gathering. There was no question about the economic factor. It's going to be maybe a better life than we had in Devonshire, in those days. But the spiritual aspect of it is going to be the temple. And are we going to give up this for whatever reason? You see what I mean?
Yeah. In Greg Prince's biography on President McKay, there was a very interesting story about a proposal for a temple ship. Do you know that story very well?
I know the story.
Talk about
like
that
a hope ship. It had a lot of traction at one time. Pretty hard to keep sacred a ship, though. And I think that was the thing that sunk it. The idea that, we can have this boat that would be a dedicated temple. And it had the reason it had traction is that it could go to places where the saints were. You could go to the islands and different countries all over the world. But I think they were, I don't know. I remember studying that when I was studying the life of David O'Mackey years ago, when I wrote the history of Brigham Young University. Shadow wrote the history. That this is going to be difficult to keep a ship afloat that's a temple and keep it sacred, going all over the place and having it serviced and everything else, plus the cost.
Do you think, what was the bigger issue? Was it the cost? Or
I can't tell you. I don't know. It's a combination of those and other factors.
Well, as I recall, I believe it was President Dyer was concerned because there's that scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants about...
On the waters.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was so much a factor, but I think it was a combination of how we're going to keep something like that sacred and how we're going to keep it, how we're going to finance it. And it didn't have the gathering impulse also, which the Swiss temple had for the Swiss folks in Europe, or the New Zealand temple had for the folks in New Zealand. It didn't have that permanency that we're here to stay. And I think that was probably the bigger factor, the gathering factor.
Well, great. Well, I know I've taken a lot of your time, but I really appreciate you sitting down with me.
Do I get a copy of some of this stuff?
Yeah,
or you got?
Sure.
Do we see this? Or, when does this go up? Do you edit this?
I'll definitely give you some warning on that. So, but yes, I'll be happy to send you a transcript and that sort of thing. So, do you have any last thoughts about the temple and temple development?
Well, we didn't get into the whole idea that temples preceded the Kirtland Temple. The whole doctrine of the temples go clear back to the beginning of it. It's been there from the beginning. It wasn't a later overlay. I think you could clearly make the argument that Moroni taught temples with his turning the hearts of the fathers to the children in 1823. Sister Beck makes that point in one of her talks very, very well, that the doctrine of eternal salvation for the dead goes clear back to Moroni. Glad tidings from Comoros. And there's that clear... I make the argument in this forthcoming book that there was a clear connection between the very, very beginning of Mormonism and what's happening in temple work today. It's the same church as it was from the very beginning. Contrary to some critics say, oh, gee, we're hardly the same church at all. By looking at plural marriage, you might argue that. But if you look at temple work and how it developed and how it was understood by those early leaders of the church, I make the argument, and I think it's very clear that it was in our DNA from the start.
Well, great. Well, it's I thank you for letting me take your afternoon here.
Yeah. I'll send you a bill.
So, anyway, once again, thank you for participating in the Gospel Tangents, and I'll have to make another appointment. We'll talk about the secession crisis next time.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Rick.
Mm-hmm. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Richard E. Bennett, professor at BYU, not to be confused with me. So he's much shorter than me, but very, very cool guy, and he's got a great name, I have to say. So hope you enjoyed the updated audio. Once again, the first time I've shown this entire thing on video and audio. So anyway, thanks again, Dr. Bennett. Really appreciate it. If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please become a paid subscriber at gospeltangents.com or patreon.com/gospeltangents. We've got full transcripts on our website at gospeltangents.com. And if you'd like to check out some of our other conversations, click over here. Thanks.